In this video, we are going to be creating a jump pad that changes colors when we interact with it and lets our character do a really big jump. Let's start by talking about the theory of what we're doing today. So in theory, we are going to have both a character and our jump pad. Both of these objects are going to have some sort of component that dictates their collision in the world. The character is going to have a capsule and our jump pad is going to be a box. When the character's capsule is overlapping with our jump pad's box, then we're going to make it look like the pad has become active by changing the color of our jump pad. And then we're going to talk to the character's movement component to give them a super jump. And as a consequence of that, whenever our character's capsule component leaves the box collider, we're going to need to make sure we take away that super jumping ability so that they don't constantly have this power up. So now that you know the plan, subscribe to the channel and let's execute our plan. Inside the C++ folder, we're going to right click to create a new C++ class that is going to be of type actor. I'm going to call this a jump pad, and then we're going to create this class. Let's go into our header file first, and we're going to need to create all of the things we're going to need as we go through and execute on our plan. For the purposes of today's tutorial, everything is going to be in the private variable section, which we're going to create right here. And this is a look at everything we're going to need. First, let's start with the properties we're going to need. We are going to need a static mesh component that I've called our jump pad mesh. This is going to be the physical representation of our jump pad in the world. It's going to be what the character can see. We're also going to create a box component that's going to be the trigger volume. This is the box that I was talking about in the theory section. This is what we are going to be looking for to see if the capsule component on the character is interacting with this box. And then we're going to create two different materials, an inactive material and an active material. These are going to be the colors of our jump pad when we are switching back and forth, depending on if our jump pad is active or not. Now we're going to talk about functions. Let me make this one a little bit easier for you to see since it's a little bit long. This function is the function that's going to be called whenever anything enters into our jump pad trigger volume. We're going to set that up inside of the C++ file, but this is the ask that we are going to be making. You will see that this looks very similar to the onComponentBegin overlap declaration that we've used in previous videos. That's because it's the exact same. A big thing I wanted to push in this video is that you don't always have to use onComponentBegin overlap or the default naming convention. You can use whatever name you want. And similar to this, we're going to use the jump pad end trigger method whenever the component is no longer overlapping with our jump pad trigger volume. So now we're good to declare all of these functions inside of our C++ file. So I'm going to hit Alt and Enter inside Visual Studio, and I'm going to create the definition of both of these methods. So now we're inside of our C++ file, and the trickiest part of the C++ coding is knowing what includes you're going to need to access all of the functions you're going to need to use. Luckily, the best part of these tutorials is I'm going to give that to you. So at the top of the file, we are going to include the following 4 files. This first one is just a representation of your character's C++ class. My project is called Third Person Tutorial, so my character is called Third Person Tutorial Character. Then on top of that, all characters have a character movement component. In order to use functions off of that, we're going to use the include game framework character movement component. And then these two just let us use the box component and capsule component respectively. Now we're going to move inside of our constructor here. Inside of the constructor, we are going to set up all of the objects that we're going to need. We're going to do that with this block of code here. First, we're going to initialize our mesh. So our jump pad mesh is going to be equal to a new subobject of type static mesh, and we're going to give it a specific name. Then we're going to do something very similar with our trigger volume. Again, the variable name changes, but we're creating a default subobject of the right type, and we're giving that a name. But what's important here is we're going to attach our trigger volume to the jump pad mesh. What this does is wherever our jump pad mesh goes, our trigger volume is going to follow. If you don't have this line of code, things get weird where all of a sudden the jump pad mesh is going to be in an entirely separate location than the trigger volume. And since all of our code on the execution of our jump pad is going to be through our trigger volume, we really want them to be together. And setting up this attachment is the best way to do that. Now we're going to talk about begin play. Begin play is called whenever the game starts or when something is spawned in. So let's think about the kind of things we want to go here. Realistically, we want to make sure that we are set and started with our inactive color, and we also need to set up all of the functions and bindings that we're going to need in order to have this object behave the way we want. And we're going to do that with this block of code here. This line of code is rather easy to read because we are simply setting the material for our jump pad mesh to whatever we decide our inactive material is going to be when we set up the blueprint for this object. And then this next section here is where we're going to bind our created functions to certain events that happen happen inside of the engine. So first we decide what is going to be the object we care about, and that is going to be our trigger volume. And we're going to say whenever our trigger volume is beginning to overlap with something, we are going to call a method on this object called jump pad trigger. And that is of course what we created earlier. And we're doing the same thing when we end the overlap. We are going to say whenever our jump pad trigger volume is no longer overlapping with something, let's call a separate method that we're going to call the jump pad end trigger. And of course we created that earlier as well. So now our objects are created, our bindings are set. Now we can go into the meat and potatoes of this and actually create our functionality. So what do we want to happen when our jump pad is triggered? Let's reference our theory from before. First, we need to make sure that the other actor that is involved in this collision, or in this case, this trigger operation, is our character. If it is our character, then we're going to do a second check to make sure that the component, or this other component that is passed through, is going to be equal to the capsule component, because that is the best physical representation of the collision in space. And then if everything in that is cool, we can then do our actual theory of updating our color and giving our character the super jump. And this is what it looks like with the actual code. First, we check, is this our character? And the way we're doing that is by simultaneously creating a variable of the correct type, or in this case, the type of our third-person tutorial character. And this is our variable called our char. And that is going to be set to be equal to a cast of the other actor towards a third-person tutorial character. Now, this is only going to be true if this other actor is a third-person tutorial character. And in the event this is true, it will then assign this value to our char. At this point, our char is no longer going to be null, which means that this entire if statement is then going to be true, which means we can go inside. Once we're inside, we need to make sure that the other component involved in this trigger is our capsule component. We do that in a similar way because we're going to cast the other component towards the uCapsule component. Then from there, we can simply check if that's equal to the capsule component that exists on our character. And if all of that is true, we can actually do the stuff. We can change our material by using this line of code that we've already seen up in our begin play method. And then we can give our character a super jump. All characters and all things that derive from characters have this character movement component that we are able to use and reference. If we go and search for all of the things that represent jumping, we can see here that there's something called the jump Z velocity, and it's set to 700 centimeters to start, so 7 meters. So what we can do is we can change the value of this Z velocity on the fly by using this character movement component. And that's ultimately what we're doing here. We have our character's reference and we're getting the character movement component of this character. And then we are looking at that jump Z velocity and we're going to multiply it by 2, just so that it's double whatever it is whenever we start. And that's all we really need to do whenever we are triggered or starting the interaction between our capsule component and this trigger volume. Now let's cover what needs to happen when we end that. Believe it or not, it is pretty much the exact same code. We're doing the same checks, which are doing the same things. The only things that change here is rather than setting to the active material, we are going to move towards the inactive material. And instead of doubling our jump, we're going to half it. The reason we get to make this assumption is because it is not ever going to happen where we are ending a trigger before we are going to be starting the trigger. So since we always are confidently knowing that this is going to double before we cut it in half, we can move with confidence here. But I will say, creating variables is probably the safer and better way to do this, but I digress. Let's save and compile everything now. And now let's create the blueprint of this by right-clicking on jump pad and then creating a blueprint class based off of it. We can call this my jump pad and I'm gonna shove this in the content folder. You can open this up and you will then see everything that we created in code has come to life. First, let's go into our jump pad mesh here and let's give it something to look at. I'm not gonna do anything fancy here. I'm just gonna make it a basic cube. But what I am going to do is I'm going to compile this so that I can set the material. And let's say we want to have a nice red as our starting material, and we'll have to remember this so that we can make this our inactive material in just a second. But then to make this into an actual pad instead of this giant cube, I'm going to go to the scale here, and I'm just going to say, let's do 2 times the scale in both the X and Y direction and 0.1 of the scale in the Z direction. So we get this nice little flat rectangle. And then if we go and click on this jump pad trigger volume, we're now able to go and zoom in and set up the actual trigger volume here. Now what's nice is we can see that it's already started to take the basic shape because we have gone ahead and done that parenting. Since it's parented to our actual mesh, it's going to take the same basic dimensions as we have before. But honestly, this doesn't cover the same amount of area, so I'm just going to roughly go and extend the box extent on the X and Y so that it about covers it. I'm not looking for anything too precise for the purposes of this tutorial. And then I'm going to expand this so it's a little bit taller, and then I'll just make sure that it sits nicely on top of our actual mesh. Now the last thing we need to do is go into the root, which is this my jump pad self at the top, and then we can go and set our inactive and active materials. Remembering from before, we were using the widget material. and that was the widget material X was going to be our inactive material. And why don't we do this alias reference as our active material, a nice bright pink. So now we can compile and save this blueprint. And let's just drag this into the screen here. And now I'll hit play. So now we can walk over. We can see it changes color whenever we interact with it. It changes back when we step off. And when we're on the jump pad, we have that nice big super jump, which comparatively is way bigger than whatever we were doing when we're not on it. And now we have our jump pad. If you found this tutorial helpful, subscribe to the channel. I'm continuing to learn Unreal Engine, and I will share everything that I learn with you.